So I hope you're all keeping well. My name is Gerald O'Sullivan. I'm head of the Department of Technology Enhanced Learning. So a warm welcome to those of you in the room and to those joining us online, which again is the greater majority of people today. And welcome as well, or at least regards to those of you watching the recording. I know there was a lot of colleagues wanted to come to today's talk who couldn't make it and were wondering if there was going to be a recording. So before I tell you about today's talk, just one or two items of housekeeping. So in the unlikely event of a fire, we'll head out in this direction. If you have any particular needs or requirements, bring them to our attention and we will do our best to help. For those of you joining us online, which is by far the greater majority, you'll have to look after yourselves, I'm afraid. But if you do have any technical difficulties, let us know and we'll do our best to help. So today we have another talk in our GenAI seminar series, and I'm just delighted to welcome and introduce you to Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani. Rajiv is the Vice Provost, Teaching and Learning in Brock University in Canada, but he's also an international scholar and well-known advocate for open educational practices and the ethical use of technology in education. So his talk today, as I understand it, is going to be very much about the intersection of those themes and values with the whole big bad world of generative AI. So we're going to run for about 45 minutes. Then we're going to say goodbye at that stage to those watching the recording. So we're going to stop the recording then. And for those then attending live in person and online, we're going to have a little bit of time for questions and discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rajiv.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Thank you. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Gerard. Thank you, Jeremiah, for doing that as well. Thank you to those of you who are joining in the room in person, and of course, the many people who are watching online, and of course, those of you who are going to be watching the recording later as well. So forgive me if I'm trying to balance the cognitive load of several sets of digital and physical eyeballs at the moment, but it is such a treat to be back at MTU. I was, of course, here last year when you wonderfully hosted the OER conference, of course, at this campus. And I feel very grateful to have spent a few days at the Kerry campus as well earlier this week, meeting with lots of folks over there. So I know Maggie, Tim, Tom Farrelly, of course, was my host. Lots of faculty members, Paul, William, Thomas, if you're watching, hello, and thank you for joining us as well. Jia I want to say. I've been trying to pick up as much Irish as I can while I'm here. But for some context, today what I really want to do is I want to draw on scholarship in critical digital pedagogy, in open educational practices, and in the ethics of technology to try and make a case for why we as educators must adopt a critical approach to both embracing open educational practices and technological advances such as GenAI. And more to the point, how if we fail to do so, fail to adopt a critical approach, we will not only betray our shared values, but we will also run the risk of undermining our very core mission as educators, of widening equitable access, of unlocking human potential, and of catalyzing societal transformation. So, lofty goals for the next 45 minutes anyway. Before I begin, I do want to acknowledge as well, and coming to you from Brock University, those of you who don't know where it is, it's about 25 minutes away from the beautiful Niagara Falls, surrounded by wineries and lakes. It's a beautiful corner of the world. The entire campus is located within a UN Biosphere Reserve, so it's quite gorgeous, and we'd welcome you to visit our lands. But of course, Brock is located on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work in the Niagara region today. The campus of Brock University, that territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And in fact, what you're seeing over here is a 2-row belt and a wampum belt, which denotes some of those partnerships with Indigenous communities in the region. So for those of you who did attend the OER conference last year, and I know there were even several staff members in Gerard's department who were fairly new at the time, you would know that I've dedicated much of my life and career to advancing open education globally, trying to widen equitable access to education in many ways. And my work is animated by Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course pushes and reminds us that higher education shall be, or should really be, equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. Now, of course, challenges related to access, as you well know, are multidimensional, they are contextual. And in the past, for example, I've worked with colleagues in places like the Yukon, where students live in remote communities without broadband internet access. And so they face both geographic and technological barriers to accessing higher education. Many of us, of course, work in the realm of accessibility, and it's been great to see the Student Digital Badge for Universal Design for Learning here at MTU. It's a really wonderful innovation. Typically, I don't see it facing students. It's more training for educators. But many of us, of course, work to try and support proactive, inclusive, universal design instead of reactive, individualized accommodations as well. Another important facet of access. And of course, cost can be a barrier, as you well know. And I should add opportunity cost along with cost, especially when very significant non-formal or informal learning is not suitably recognized and credited for students as well. Now, over the past 15 years, I'm going to speak to one particular barrier to access that's less a feature in the Irish higher education landscape, thank goodness, but unfortunately is in North America, bless you. And it has to do with the affordability of course materials, such as textbooks, for example. And there's many reasons why textbooks has been a worthy barrier to try and tackle and overcome. One is, of course, the fact that in North America, the cost of course materials can actually rival the cost of tuition for a single course, which itself is criminal. But I think really it's emblematic for me, this issue, bless you, that despite the promise and potential of higher education to serve as a force for economic and social mobility, that it continues to be structured in ways that are sometimes subtle, like textbook costs, that actually end up reinforcing and replicating existing societal power hierarchies. And so that's really the focus of much of my work. So for example, back in 2017, when my partner, Dr. Jhangiani, and I conducted research on the affordability of course materials in our home province of British Columbia, we surveyed students across 12 post-secondary institutions, and we found that just over half reported not purchasing their required course materials due to cost. Just over a quarter reported taking fewer courses or not registering for a specific course or section due to cost. And in fact, 17% reported taking or dropping or withdrawing from a course, once again, due to the high cost of course materials. That's how that question ends in the survey instrument. And as research in different jurisdictions has shown time and time again, these kinds of terrible choices are disproportionately likely to be made by students who are marginalized in various ways. Students with disabilities, students who are first in their family to attend university, for example, racialized students as well. And this hasn't changed much. Don't expect you to look at the detail in this graph, but this is just to share that we did a similar research at my now current university, at Brock University last year, and we saw very similar patterns. And once again, we found that first-generation university students were more likely to be forced into making these terrible choices, which is often a choice between groceries and course materials, for example. Now, there's no big secret as to why textbook costs have been such an issue in North America. For one, the cost of commercial textbooks themselves have risen by between 3 and 4 times the rate of inflation pretty much since 1977. And the students have obviously been forced into these difficult choices, but rather than just showing you the graph over here, and CPI is the consumer price index, so that gives you a sense of inflation effectively. I will quote the CEO of Cengage, one of the largest commercial textbook companies in the world, who in 2018 said, and I quote, that there are millions of students out there who are making very painful trade-offs in the purchase of learning materials relative to paying the rent, paying for basic needs, food, etc., and that we as an industry have chosen for a long time to basically ignore that, or have more or less been paying lip service to them. I find it shocking that a CEO would actually say this out. I said the quiet part out loud, effectively. But for me, this is a good reminder of, if you're ever wondering if you can truly reconcile a primary duty to students with the primary obligation to shareholders, this is a good example, I think, of some of that tension. So of course, as an individual educator, I did, like many others, what I could. I co-authored an open textbook that I'm happy to say is now in its 4th edition, and it's been adapted for use around the world. Ended up conducting research on the efficacy of OER, open educational resources, that added to the now sizable and growing literature that typically shows that students assigned free and open educational resources, typically they perform the same as those assigned expensive commercial resources. And where there is a difference, typically that difference actually favors the students assigned OER, remarkably. So that's good. But one of the reasons I love working with OER is because of research like this. This is a large research study with, I think, over 22,000 students, or nearly 22,000 students in the state of Georgia in the US. And it really showed that the very same marginalized students who disproportionately suffer at the hands of high textbook costs, at the mercy of commercial textbook publishers, they disproportionately, in fact, benefit from the use of OER. And so they benefit not just in economic terms, but in educational terms. And so in this case, you're seeing things like OER use improves end-of-course grades. It decreases lower grades and withdrawals and failures, more so for Pell recipient students, which are students who qualify for federal subsidies for education. It's an indicator of low socioeconomic status, for example, but also part-time students and populations historically underserved by higher education. And so this is why I really, really like working with OER. When I ended up years later assuming the role of Associate Vice Provost for Open Education at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, which is on the west coast of Canada, my colleagues and I were determined to move beyond the sporadic, accidental, wonderful, but individual approach to OER adoption. We wanted to move towards a more vertical integration, a more programmatic approach. And by really supporting the adoption of OER across the curriculum of entire degree programs. And so in doing so, we launched what became Canada's first zero textbook cost degree programs. This was centered, of course, on the creation, the adaptation, and eventually the adoption of OER. And as this next slide depicts, over a 6-year period since its launch, and by the time I left KPU, this initiative saved our students more than 15 million Canadian dollars. But even more impressively, these cost savings did not come at the cost of educational outcomes, right? As students enrolled in what we called ZTC, or zero textbook cost sections or programs, they earned higher grades. They withdrew from courses or programs at lower rates. And so it actually ended up having an economic benefit to the institution in terms of tuition retained, which is an entirely different conversation, of course. But in case you wish to learn more, these results are outlined in this paper that was published earlier this year in the journal Open Praxis. But again, I want to underscore that significant savings to students, cost savings, are in many ways the least significant benefits of using open educational resources. And I will point to the scholarship of Sarah Lambert, who is working with Deakin University down in Australia, who in this article in the Journal of Learning for Development wrote about how with open education, we need to think not only about redistributive justice, which involves really allocating resources to those who by circumstance have less, but also recognitive justice. So for example, with redistributive justice, if you use OER, you save students money, that's addressing economic maldistribution, certainly. But if you want to address recognitive justice, that has to do with recognition and respect for cultural and gender difference, for example. You can also go further and look at representational justice, which has to do with equitable representation and political voice. So I'll try to bring this to life with a couple of examples. First, I think this is a really nice example of recognitive justice from my home discipline of psychology. This shows where faculty members are taking advantage of the permissions. Whoopsie, I should have skipped over this. This shows where faculty members are taking advantage of the permissions of open licensing to really remix and revise open educational resources to rectify the underrepresentation of historically marginalized psychologists in textbooks for history of psychology, for example. You see a lot of this, of course, in the field, whitewashing of the history of disciplines. This is another article, again, by a fellow psychologist that looks to leverage the power of OER to challenge the academic gatekeeping to ensure that equitable representation is not just in terms of access or content, but also in terms of authorship. Who gets to author and create and publish these textbooks in the first place? And the final piece of scholarship I will point to over here is the truly exceptional work of Cheryl Hodgkinson-Williams and Henry Trotter from the University of Cape Town, formerly, in advancing a social justice framework for OER across the global south. and this time I will pause at the table that comes along with this. I should say all of the research I've pointed to so far is open access research, because of course, why wouldn't publicly funded research be available to the public? I'm not a fan of communicating in exclusive channels and pretending that exclusivity and elitism is the same thing as impact and access. So this table also comes from that very article, and it outlines how it is within the economic dimension, if you look at the second row, that we deal with maldistribution as an injustice. And so we can engage in redistribution, as I said, with the use of OER as a positive, ameliorative response. But as they note in the final column on the right, if we wish not just to address injustice, but also address the root causes of injustice, then we need to go further and seek a more transformative response. So for example, a change in the manner in which educational materials, such as textbooks or academic journals, how they are created, how they are adapted, how they are disseminated, how their production is funded by governments, institutions, or donors. Next, if you look at the cultural dimension, a change in the manner in which, within the cultural dimension, we're talking about misrecognition in many ways. And so in this case, an ameliorative response can be what you saw. It can involve the creation, the localization, the redistribution of OER in preferred languages, for example, in alternative epistemic stances as well. But a transformative response would go further. It would involve dismantling the power relations, the social hierarchies, the cultural hegemonies that currently underpin the canons, the assumed norms and values, what is thought to be the required reading of a particular discipline as well. And finally, it is within the political dimension down there that we deal with misrepresentation as an injustice. In this case, an ameliorative response could be the provision for representation for underrepresented peoples. It could create an opportunity for more participatory decision-making. But a transformative approach would really provide the opportunity for all relevant stakeholders to decide on what is really important educationally and to avoid becoming objects of charity or benevolence, or even non-persons with respect to the approach to justice. Now, if all of this, or some of this perhaps, comes across as some kind of political activism more than education, I will of course suggest that they are one and the same. And I draw inspiration over here from the late, great Bell Hooks, who wrote about how her commitment to engaged pedagogy is in fact an expression of political activism. And so at this point, I would challenge you, those of you online as well, to think about what you understand as the true purpose or even the purposes of higher education. I know for many of us, these are represented perhaps in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And perhaps this is also why Quality Education Goal 4 I placed in the center, because I see quality education as central to advancing progress for all of the other SDGs, of course. But talking about the SDGs also calls to mind the importance of rethinking our approach to teaching and learning. And as this important UNESCO publication has pointed out, education for sustainable development does not only integrate the contents such as climate change, poverty, sustainable consumption into the curriculum, it asks for an action-oriented, transformative pedagogy. And that's what supports self-directed learning, participation and collaboration, problem orientation, inter- and transdisciplinarity, and the linking of formal and informal learning. Only such pedagogical approaches, it says in this report, make possible the development of the key competencies needed for promoting sustainable development. It's a wonderful publication again. And in my mind, when we talk about this kind of action-oriented transformative pedagogy, to me this has a lot to do with the field of open pedagogy. And if you're unfamiliar, open pedagogy was even recognized, in fact, as an important direction forward at the 10th anniversary of the important Cape Town Open Education Declaration. There's many different definitions of open pedagogy, and I have one myself, but my favorite one, I think, is a recent one from a wonderful new collection called Pedagogy Opened. And so I'll put this up over here, again, an open access publication. But it's described as teaching and learning practices and environments that promote equity, collaboration, and innovation, and that invite students to create and share knowledge with future publics, often in association with the use of open educational resources. So in fact, with open pedagogy, OER can co-occur. But using OER is not a requirement per se of embracing open pedagogy. And so this is why with open pedagogy, it draws on both the power of open licensing on the one hand, but also the tradition of critical pedagogy. And in doing so, open pedagogy foregrounds values such as access and equity, but also agency and ownership, community and action, all while attending to both opportunities and risks. And of course, you can see behind it lie things like empathy and curiosity and responsibility and participation. I often think it's easier to understand open pedagogy in relief. And so I'm going to share with you an image from a French book published about 100 years ago. So this is actually in the public domain, so it's an open educational resource as well. But this book tried to depict scenarios for the future. And in this case, it depicted the classroom of the year 2000. It's really fun to look at it if you think. And I think it's easy to laugh at this illustration, but to me, it's fascinating to look at the ideology that pervades this illustration, this depiction of pedagogy, right? First of all, there's not a lot of diversity in the classroom. Let's acknowledge that. But again, the approach to teaching and learning, there's no active learning. The information somehow being, electronically transferred into students' minds. They're not even taking notes. No peer learning. And of course, the educator is feeding received wisdom, as it were, into this tool. And in case you miss it, on the right, standing beside the professor doing the actual manual labor, is probably the graduate student teaching assistant doing the actual work. But nonetheless, as I said, easy to laugh at this, but in many ways, I think what we do today is not necessarily that different. If you think about large classes and question banks from publishers and multiple choice questions, and how in many ways, despite wanting to move away from it, this is the banking model of education that Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher and educator, wrote about in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He described this model as how it turns students into containers to be filled by the teacher. And so the more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. And so education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. It's a terrible indictment. There's a lot going on in that paragraph. But in practical terms, how do we move away from this with open pedagogy? I think this involves things like co-creating course policies with students, schedules of work, even giving them a choice of different ways to demonstrate their achievement of learning outcomes, for example, thinking about agency alongside access. But one of the more common approaches to embracing open pedagogy involves the design and use of so-called renewable assignments. And I'll put this article up, also open access. Because unlike traditional so-called disposable assignments that typically end up in the physical or perhaps the digital recycling bin after the student receives their mark, renewable assignments differ in at least three ways. For one, they have a wider audience. It's not just the instructor or the teaching assistant who's looking at work. It could even involve public scholarship. Second, they have a longer life than the term of the course or the year. They could live on indefinitely, could serve as a resource for future cohorts of students, for example. And third, it has a greater impact, or gravity as they describe it in this article, than simply the student's learning. The student's learning and skill development will always be more important. But in this case, students might be involved in the co-creation of OER, that of course will continue to be a gift that gets re-gifted and gets more dear each time. The prototypical example of a renewable assignment is, of course, the Wikipedia assignment, wherein students, as part of their coursework, are editing or even authoring articles in Wikipedia. And this approach is well supported by the Wiki Education Foundation, and it's a wonderful illustration of how students can contribute to this future publics or public knowledge commons. But once again, even with a Wikipedia, one can take an approach that is more deliberately social justice oriented. Right? Because you can provide lay summaries of otherwise paywall scholarly research in Wikipedia, absolutely. But you can also intentionally think about representation of articles about women scientists in Wikipedia, for example. So you can think about it more intentionally in that way. But loads of other examples, I'll do this very quickly, but I've worked with instructors who've moved away from in-class presentations and instead students creating instructional videos to cover specific concepts. In this case, principles of persuasion. And the students in this case from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, they not only won an international student video competition, but their video is now being used by educators from Hawaii to Turkey to teach the science of persuasion. And that's the power we're unlocking over here. As another example, these are students from my own classes where they're using an open textbook that you're seeing on the left, and we're using an open source digital annotation tool called Hypothesis to annotate the text. On the top is a student augmenting the examples in the text from an example from her own life, and at the bottom sharing an external resource, a video clip from a cultural reference that again, I don't have to worry about what makes sense or what students will relate to today. They are better placed to do it. And in doing so, it's not just having a discussion forum in the margins of the text, they've enriched the text now for the next cohort of students tremendously. So this is an easy way to engage in open pedagogy. And of course, students can go much further. This is an example of a volume on environmental science that was co-authored by students where they're writing bite-sized chunks. The volume is edited by the faculty member in the course and it's published. It's had multiple volumes at this point as well. So really, open pedagogy can be quite liberating. But as a reminder, we are talking about critical pedagogy over here. So it's not just about access, it is about agency. And so in doing so, I will point to the work of Henry Giroux as well, who reminds us that critical pedagogy really asserts that students can engage their own learning from a position of agency. It takes seriously, he writes, the educational imperative to encourage students to act on the knowledge, on the values, on the social relations they acquire by being responsive to the deepest and most important problems of our times. And of course, that brings us back full circle to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And so I will say it was a particular delight when I was at Kwantlen Polytechnic University for us to join, and you can do this as well, what has become an international, interinstitutional, interdisciplinary open pedagogy fellowship for faculty that focuses on the SDGs. And in this program, faculty members from different disciplines and institutions, they come together focused on specific SDGs, and they design course assignments that are then deployed across their campuses and their different disciplines that often involve students creating OER as part of their coursework, but OER that advances progress towards specific SDGs. And so this is one of my favorite examples from our 2019 cohort, where as you can see at the bottom, we had 3 faculty members from urban ecosystems, sustainable horticulture, and anthropology. And they designed an assignment that involves students mapping the edible weeds across their different campuses of their different universities. So it's a really clever way to address the issue of zero hunger, but in a way that was in a public scientific quality database that was open access as well. It's tremendously engaging. And so I'm saying engaging because, as you might imagine, students who engage in open pedagogy not only experience all of the benefits of authentic assessment, but they also typically pour more energy, more creativity, and they certainly take more pride in their work, as these 2 articles illustrate. Also open access. I should stop saying that. Just assume that everything I'm pointing you to is open access. The article on the left by Kelly talks about how students who chose to publish their work openly reported significantly less shame, significantly more pride, enjoyment, and positive beliefs about writing. And in the article on the right by Worth and Williams, a plurality of students preferred the project that involved open pedagogy when they were given the choice. They also indicated it increased their engagement and their skills acquisition. Now, if you're interested in exploring more examples of open pedagogy in practice, I will point you to the Open Pedagogy Portal, which has examples from a wide variety of disciplines. It's created and maintained by a group called the Open Education Network. It is, by the way, an international network that MTU might also consider joining to help build your capacity in this space. Now, all of this is exciting, right? Because we talk about innovation, we're talking about engaging pedagogy that certainly captures students' attention as well. But it is important to still bring a critical lens to this work because, as with OER, it is easy to do harm with the very best of intentions. So with OER, for example, you think about if we reproduce hegemonic perspectives, we're not doing a wonderful thing. We can engage in gatekeeping, as I said, about who's permitted to create OER. We can devalue the labor involved in authoring OER. We can publish OER that is not accessible, no alt text for images, no captioning for videos, for example, or OER that has no offline alternatives for students who do not have access at home, for example, or who are remote. And that's just one example with OER. And so with open educational practices like open pedagogy, my colleagues Mahabali, Catherine Cronin, who many of you might know as well, and we sought to draw on that earlier social justice framework for OER and extend that idea to the broader open educational practices as well, like open pedagogy. For example, we outlined how open pedagogy can be neutral or negative. If there's insufficient scaffolding or skill development for students, if we disregard the unevenly distributed risks of public scholarship for students, for example, if we do not prepare and support and protect our students in that domain. It can be positive, right? We can make scholarship more generally accessible, as this slide says, to populations who would not be able to afford them otherwise. But it can also be transformative, and that typically happens, example, when marginalized groups are designing the content and the processes, and when epistemology and structural academic gatekeeping are challenged. We also explained how open pedagogy can be more teacher-centric or more student-centric. It can be more content-centric or more process-centric. And it can be primarily about learning, or it can be intentionally oriented towards social justice. And it's along those three dimensions that you typically find the difference between approaches that are ameliorative and those that are transformative. Now, more recently, a few colleagues and I at Brock engaged in experimental research in which we manipulated the design of a course, an introductory psychology course, to intentionally integrate these principles of redistributive, recognitive, and then representational justice. We did it in an additive fashion, so first one and then the next and then the next. And so we did this by manipulating the approach taken with course materials, which is the second column. And that went from starting with an expensive commercial textbook, which is sort of normative practice in Canada, to using an open educational resource, to using a localized OER, to eventually an open textbook that was co-authored with students. You can see how we went further and further and further along those principles. We did the same with course assignments, a traditional research project, then to a Wikipedia assignment, then to a Wikipedia assignment that was focused on marginalized group representation, and eventually focusing this explicitly on excluded perspectives as well. And finally, with course policies that went from standard, relatively strict policies to far more inclusive and supportive policies that not only made space for engagement by diverse learners, but also invited learners to co-create the learning journey, as with open pedagogy. And as this article about our study, which was recently published in the journal Open Praxis, demonstrated, increased social justice framing led to a greater intent to register in the course when we assessed that among students. It led to more positive perceptions of both school support and acceptance, as well as better relations with faculty and staff. And it also led to higher instructor evaluations, remarkably. I know instructor evaluations are terribly problematic anyway, but they're still used in our context, so it was of interest. And so what we're saying over here is, in short, students can tell when you design your learning environments intentionally oriented towards justice, and they respond. Now, of course, the notion of designing for justice doesn't extend only to course materials, course assignments, or course policies, right? It's taken me a while to get here, but you knew we were going to talk about AI at some point in this seminar series. So, of course, designing for justice concerns our educational technologies, right? And so that's why I think about our student-centric, process-centric, social justice-oriented approach to pedagogy in the context of the proliferation, or dare I say the infiltration as well, of generative artificial intelligence. And I will say it's great to see, as on your way in, you might have seen it, those of you who are attending in person, those of you online, if you visit this campus, a beautiful collection of a history of evolving technology outside. But as much nostalgia as I get at looking at as a physical example of a ZX Spectrum that I played with in the 80s, or a Game Boy in the 90s, for example, I think it should also serve as a reminder that we should remember not to fall prey so easily to the technology hype cycle either. And so, a few examples of that. Some of you may know that back in 1922, Thomas Edison talked about how the motion picture was destined to revolutionize our education system, and how in just a few years it would supplant largely, if not entirely, the use of textbooks. I wish that he were right. Or more recently in '99, when the CEO of Cisco predicted that education over the internet would make email usage look like a rounding error. Again, alas, if you notice the retreat following remote emergency teaching and COVID-19, you'll know how wrong that is. Or when indeed Sebastian Thrun, the co-founder of Udacity, predicted at the height of the MOOC craze that by 2060 there will be only 10 institutions delivering higher education, and of course that his own company might be one of those 10. And I'm not even going to bother wasting your time by giving you an inflated quote about blockchain or NFTs, because that would just take up too much time with giggling. So what I'm saying is, when you feel the pressure to go all in on AI because of these inevitability narratives that we continually encounter, or because Bill Gates said something silly again, which he does with fair regularity, about how all jobs will evaporate in the face of AI, or if you're looking at Arizona State University, an institution that has not just jumped in, up to its hip, but well over its head with AI. I'll show you what this looks like, by the way. They've deployed AI agents to do everything possible for their faculty. If you look at the very bottom, there's one AI agent, and agentic AI, of course, requires less human intermediation. One AI agent that will draft the course outline and learning objectives. Another one that will draft the syllabus, for example. The next one that will create the modules. The next one that will script the lectures. And the next one that will design the assessments as well. And you might well wonder at this point where the educator plays a role. And of course, the educator does play a role, because you need to have the expertise to evaluate the output of OER, or of AI. But this is an example that is creating an example of an institution that has really jumped in well more than neck deep at this point with AI. And so I think what this leads to in many ways is a fear of being left behind. And I think it's entirely natural, certainly for leadership, for governments to feel that fear as well. And I think this is why it's a challenging time. But I do think it's important that we not make costly mistakes that are driven by fear at this time especially. Because there's no shortage of educational technology companies that will happily funnel your limited public funding into their very own balance sheets through a combination of overblown promises and plumas. And so I agree with Neil Selwyn, who wrote back in 2011 that the current understanding of schools in the digital age is hampered by this curious amnesia, forgetfulness, or even a willful ignorance of past phases of technology development and implementation. At the same time, I will say I do think AI is here to stay. I do not think it's feasible or desirable to ignore it, and I do think it is futile to attempt to prohibit it or detect it. So I'll give you those caveats. We know, for example, that educators are using AI to support a wide range of tasks, and I apologize for how small that slide is. I'll happily make my slides available to everybody after the session as well. And there should be a QR code that might be hidden actually by the picture over there. But everything from brainstorming ideas for lesson plans and assignments, to simplifying complex topics for students, to supporting accessibility in the classroom. And of course, we know that students are using AI to support a range of learning tasks, whether authorized or not, right? Including brainstorming to get started with assignments, to summarize information, to get initial feedback on their work. And there have been important discussions and developments at the nexus of OER and AI as well. This is the Dubai Declaration, which pointed to potential opportunities to advance work on open educational resources, supporting discovery, translation, curation, indexing of OER, for example. But this declaration also stressed the importance of transparency, of inclusivity, of equity and collaboration with GenAI. It pointed to open ecosystems as key to supporting access while protecting intellectual property. And I will also point to the ongoing work of Creative Commons, which is working on what they call CC signals. This will allow dataset holders to signal their preferences for how their content might be reused by machines based on a set of limited but meaningful options that are shaped in the public interest. So CC signals in this way are both a technical and a legal tool, as well as a social proposition. It's a call for a new pact in some ways between those who are sharing data and those who are using it to train AI models. And I think these are important conversations to have, right? While it is important to acknowledge that this Silicon Valley culture of moving fast and breaking things is not an ethical approach in education, right? Unlike the venture capital funded firms in the Valley, we cannot simply do harm, apologize, and roll back programs if there is an uproar. We cannot simply shut down an organization and look to start up a new university. We cannot develop and sustain models that are exploitative of our students and are devastating to our communities. The Valley's reliance on venture capital and its obsession with unicorns means that the pressure to prioritize revenue over ethics is incredibly strong. And this is why I think Silicon Valley is flush with exploitative business models. That's why I cringe when I hear edtech vendors say that, well, we've got this next product, this is Uber for this or Netflix for that. That itself should be the first red flag right there. Or, as I said, uncritically and unnecessarily injecting the latest buzzword tech into their offerings because of shareholder pressure, GenAI being the obvious example at this point. So I would say we need to be more careful. We need to be slower, more responsible, certainly more ethical, especially when we're talking about student data. Haney Farid is a computer scientist at Dartmouth College in the US, and he wrote, if a biologist said, here's a really cool virus, let's see what happens when the public gets their hands on it, that wouldn't quite be acceptable. And that's exactly what Silicon Valley does all the time. It's indicative, he wrote, of a very immature industry. We have to understand the harm and slow down how we deploy technology like this. And as Ruha Benjamin writes in her important book, Race After Technology, it's only by pulling back the curtain and drawing attention to forms of coded inequity. And that's how we not only become more aware of the social dimensions of technology, but how we can work together against the emergence of a digital caste system that relies on our naivety when it comes to the neutrality of technology. That's an important last phrase. Naivety when it comes to the neutrality of technology. Because we live in an era of platform capitalism, where platforms like Google and Amazon, of course, operate digital infrastructure that serves as a foundation for others to conduct business, facilitate transactions, interact with users. And these platforms rely on massive amounts of user data they can evolve, as they have, into powerful monopolies. We also live in the era of surveillance capitalism. This is the new economic order that claims human experience as the free raw material for hidden commercial practices of extraction, prediction, and sales. So as we seek to design and deliver education, I think it becomes increasingly necessary to ask ourselves, as this illustration by the talented Irishman Brian Mathers suggests, whether we are surfing the open web or whether we are in fact serfs in a feudal web. And for me, one of the paths forward is to embrace the principles of design justice. I'll put up 3 of them. This is, for example, designed to sustain, to heal, and empower our communities, to seek liberation, in fact, from exploitative and oppressive systems, to prioritize design's impact over the community, over the intentions of the designer, and to center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. And this final principle is, in fact, one of the reasons why I think, for me, one of the most interesting developments over the last couple of years and university documents to come out of these discussions of AI has been this student manifesto for assessment in the age of AI from students at the London School of Economics. I really recommend you look at this because it demonstrates how, first of all, mature students' perspectives are, how they recognize limitations and biases with AI, how they are attentive to inequitable access, and how they want to work towards a culture of transparency and trust. This is important. And of course, I'm not going to get into all of this because this would be a whole other talk, but inequitable access, amplifications of societal biases, lack of transparency are there on the left. They are just 3 of many, many, many ethical considerations with AI. This is not even an exhaustive list. Right? We think critically about privacy and data sovereignty, about the protection of intellectual property. We need to stop paying lip service to the environmental impact of GenAI and how much water it takes to cool those servers. I was at a conference recently, and they took an indigenous perspective, which talks about the 7th generation principle. You make decisions based on the impact 7 generations from now. And they said if it takes 2 glasses of water to engage in a whole query exchange with ChatGPT, 25 to 45 back and forths effectively. Whose 2 cups of water am I using over here? Thinking a bit more critically about this, for example. There are legal implications over here, everything from accountability and governance to misrepresentation and liability. There was a chatbot from Air Canada recently that led to a suit of the company because it gave incorrect advice to a couple who was seeking to cancel a flight. Again, you are responsible for the output over here, even if you use it for academic advising at MTU, for example. We can talk about labor, both in terms of the employment of individuals across the global south to moderate and screen, frankly, traumatizing content on AI, as well as the displacement of skilled labor. And there's questions about the inadvertent de-skilling that occurs when learners uncritically engage in cognitive offloading, right? Avoiding what psychologists would call desirable difficulty. It's the real sweat of the learning process that earns those dividends. And so this is why, of course, we have to support not just critical AI literacy, but really attend much more to metacognition during the learning process as well and embed those reflections. And finally, I'll reference the paradox of participation, which is a really important concept, not widely understood, but it reflects the bind that I think many groups find themselves in with regard to AI. You think about indigenous peoples with traditional sacred knowledge. You think about linguistic minorities, and I had a conversation recently with somebody from Southeast Asia as well. It's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. They feel pressure to contribute to the corpus of data that's training AI, because if they don't, they feel like they will be erased from the future of search engines. But if they do, they're handing over knowledge that should never be in the public domain either. That's what they mean by the paradox of participation. And so these are the critical questions that we need to ask. This is also why my university has now formally adopted through our Senate a few months ago an ethical framework to educational technologies. That means if we're procuring technologies formally through an RFP, these are some of the criteria that the vendors have to live up to or speak to, for example. But even if it's individual educators and guiding the decisions we make, these are, of course, not necessarily exhaustive, but these are certainly 11 critical principles from our perspective. I'll share all of this with you later as well. This is also a really fantastic recent publication out of UNESCO as well. And I think it does a wonderful job discussing many of the dilemmas, many of the directions, many of the frictions, right? There's a lot of space between uncritical excitement and somebody who wants to absolutely pretend that none of this has ever happened and bury their heads in the sand. And so I also want to pay tribute over here while I'm talking about this to the excellent scholarship in this space at MTU, including this paper, co-authored by the wonderful William Evans from your Department of Nursing, for example, and of course the inimitable Tom Farrelly. If you know Tom, you know that every time you're around him, the crack is 90. Did I get that right? Excellent. Thank you. So as Laurie Phipps and Donna Lanclough have reminded us, EdTech will not save us, and certainly GenAI will not save us. So while some are going to excitedly point to the possibilities of creating, localizing, translating, enriching open content, they might even salivate at the prospect of all of the gains and efficiencies, all of the data extraction that comes from unabashedly embracing platform capitalism. I would urge caution, because there are several paradoxes with AI. You can see a great race to make knowledge more widely available, but curiously, it's done in a way that makes hallucinations and misinformation widely available. There's a race to provide personalized education, but it's done curiously in a way that's incredibly impersonal with no human involved at all. There's a lot of rhetoric around the democratization of education, and yet what we see is an oligopoly and privatization of education through this philosophy of neoliberalism. You see a strong desire to draw on as large a corpus as possible of training data, but done in a way that actually steals IP from writers, from artists, from scholars. You hear promises around widening access, but you can see in many ways AI is widening inequities as we go. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there are no good possibilities here, but the risks are quite significant. And without engaging in AI critically, including considering whether it's even appropriate to engage with AI in a particular space, not just allowing it in everywhere, we will definitely do harm. And this is why I think one of the interesting paradoxes is, as desire continues to grow for greater technology adoption, what becomes even more essential is in fact humanistic education, right? You need more critical thinking, you need more ethical reasoning, more collaboration, more communication, more humanity, effectively. And so I will say, please do not let, and I'm going to look into the camera over here, please do not let people gaslight you into thinking that adopting a critical approach with AI is somehow anti-tech, anti-progress, stuck in the mud, denialist or traditionalist position. That is simply an intellectually dishonest critique. Let me just say that. As Martin Weller wrote in his book, 25 Years of EdTech, one can still be enthusiastic about the application of technology to benefit learners while being aware of the broader implications, questioning claims, and advocating or conducting research about real impacts. So, as I close, I will leave you with a few prompts for self-reflection. For one, as educators, I would urge you to resist these inevitability narratives with AI, to proceed with warranted caution, to ideally design for justice, but at the very least, low bar, design not to do harm. Remember that when people talk about pedagogy before technology, technologies influence and define the pedagogy instantiated within instructional and learning designs. And as Tim Fawns pointed out, technology is entangled within pedagogy. So it's not actually possible to first choose a pedagogy and then tack on a technology, nor can pedagogy be tacked on to a technology. Remember that if we do not foreground access and equity and justice, we're not just doing harm, we are in fact abdicating our core responsibility as educators. Open education is not just about access, it is also about agency. So think about enhancing agency for learners at this time instead of simply availing of agentic AI. When it comes to assessment, think about both assessment for learning as well as assessment for learning. Formative and open assessments become even more valuable at this time. And of course, we're moving past traditional notions of cheating and plagiarism. I know many of you are aware of Sarah Eaton and Rahul Kumar's post-plagiarism framework. And there's a talk and discussion we're having on Monday that you might want to participate in as well as part of National Academic Integrity Week, hosted by DCU as well and the ILTA about GenAI and academic integrity. And finally, do everything in your power to push back against this prevailing transactional model of education, because education at its best is empowering, it is liberatory, and it is transformative, right? So as I said, we can innovate in open education with OER, with open pedagogy, with GenAI as well. But if we do so in a way, if we wish to do so in a way that fosters resilient societies, that supports sustainable development, we have to take a critical approach. Otherwise, we're going to risk undermining the very values that we hold, that undermine and drive our work. We can widen inequities, we can lose control of our data and our intellectual property, we can amplify societal biases, we can accelerate climate change, all while de-skilling future generations, right? In North America, this all plays into the public perception of higher education and the weakening of support for democratic institutions and the defunding of our sector as well. If we uncritically adopt what I'm going to call the techno sludge that Silicon Valley excretes, we could easily find ourselves in a world, and it's probably around the corner, where students are submitting AI-generated content that's then marked by AI-driven grading platforms. It's incredibly efficient. There's just zero education happening in there. And so, as my friend Kevin Gannon has written, the real work of change in higher education is done students by students, classroom by classroom, course by course. And it's done by educators who have committed to teaching because it and their students matter. I will stop over there. But Guru Mahagat, thank you very much.
So thanks for a really engaging and thought-provoking session. You've given us a lot to reflect on in terms of how we can and should hold fast to values of openness, inclusivity, social justice, design justice, and learner agency as we try to figure out how to navigate the current moment. So we're going to bring the recording to an end now, and I'll just say sincere thanks to Rajiv for your time and your generosity in sharing your insights with us today. It's been great.
The honor is mine. Thank you very much, Karod.
And thanks for all the Irish as well.